a real pleasure, privilege to be asked to share this afternoon session. Some of you may know me as @SimonSimply, for those of you who are on Twitter as well, and I do encourage you to keep up the fantastic tweeting that's been going on in relation to this conference. We've had all the housekeeping, I think, about fire alarms earlier, but just a couple of notices. We've got a lost property. Does anybody recognise this? This is a nicely bound pink spiral bound notebook. Yep, okay, got a person over there. I would say it was a terrific read, but obviously we respect your public and the other thing, we've actually got a lost person. So, Jinan, where are you? Jinan, do stand up. We'll all remember our fantastic colleague from Lebanon yesterday. Jinan had a really good meeting with somebody on the first day of this conference, somebody who'd done some work with training and education, I think, in Palestine, and she's lost that person's contact details. So if you are that person, or you think you know who that person may be, please find Jinan, because this conference, a lot of this is going to be about networking and the ripples that come out from here, and it's going to be so exciting to be able to hear all about that. I was actually at a conference a few weeks ago, and this is a conference, a film that had been made by Mary. Where are you, Mary? Mary and her friends, her colleagues, have made a terrific film that they showed up in the Northwest. And they got 100 people into that room to talk about engaging with Black and minority ethnic communities in the Northwest. The inspiration from that had come from two people going to a conference in Birmingham that we'd been at 2 years earlier. So at that conference in Birmingham, about 100, 150 people were there. Two of them rippled out, and another conference, a film, the whole project came off the back of that. We have no idea actually what all the ripples and where all the ripples from these 3 days will get to. And that's actually one of the really exciting things about it. We'll hear about some of it along the way. But I just want to thank all of you for your commitment that's brought you here, but above all for the commitment you're going to be taking as you go from here back to where you are, back to communities that you live and work in, and all the exciting, extraordinary things that are going to happen as a result. So thank you very much indeed for all that you're going to be doing. It's my huge pleasure to introduce Julian Abel now. We all know Julian, I think, or many of us do, and Julian's biography is in the prospectus, so I won't say much about that. All I will say is that we were talking just beforehand. He said to me, I wonder when the adrenaline crash is going to kick in after these 3 days. And as long as it's not in the next half an hour, I think we'll be all right. So, Julian, without further ado, over to you.
I suspect that we're not going to see ripples, we're going to see giant waves come out of this conference. So one of the things that is apparent from where I've been sitting and listening is the incredible noise and the happiness and the joy that's been going on. And that's not bad for a conference about death, dying and loss. We don't typically associate so much happiness with death and dying, but I think I'm going to argue that maybe we do. And I think that that we absolutely acknowledge that the experience of the whole business of having a terminal illness for both the person who's got the illness and the people around them is full of sadness. But I think we're all focused on how do we make the most out of the time we have left. And of course, we don't need to be dying to do that, and we don't need to be suffering from bereavement, but it really helps to focus our minds if we are. So, one of the most central things for all of us is about the presence of good relationships with the world around us. That actually we exist somehow in the reflections of the people around us, and that we search for harmony and peace and joy and happiness through our relationships with the world around us. And there's two of them that are doing that. One's not so happy, but nevertheless, when we're thinking about people at end of life, the people around us are really, really significant. And in the context of, I'm a palliative care physician, and the context of what we do, part of it is therapeutics. But actually, I don't know whether my colleagues will agree, and I don't even know whether they'll like me for saying it. I think therapeutics is the easy part of palliative medicine. We use about 30 drugs or something like that. I mean, it's not particularly complex, and we kind of get used to the drugs so we know what they do. So it's actually not the main bit. But the main bit is in the context of how do we help people to make the most out of the time they have left? And that's really about often for the people who are experiencing the illness, making the most is not the first thing on their mind, because quite often they're suffering incredible losses. They have loss of appearance, loss of role. Actually, one of the worst symptoms that people suffer is weakness and fatigue, and we can do very little about it. And it's not the weakness and fatigue itself that's so bad, it's the fact that it robs them of being the person that they know and recognize. And so there's a sense of lack of loss of identity and a lack of ability to do the things that return life to normal. And so making the most in that context is quite tough. And a common conversation I have with people is that we value others for who they are, but we value ourselves for what we do. We've got this kind of weird way of looking at our own value and meaning. And so there's something of a transition to be made about understanding that people value us for who we are. And it's quite a big one to take on board when you're feeling awful and your body appearance has changed and your hair is falling out and you can't look after yourself. And I don't know if any of you have seen Up. Hands up who's seen Up. That's quite a few. It's the start of the film, about the first 10 minutes. It does this really beautiful little life story of the old man and the young man, and it just takes us through his life and how he gets married, has a job, and then has a very close relationship with his wife, and then his wife dies. And it's a beautiful little piece of film. Anyway, he really looks like his wife had died there. It's kind of very expressive, and you can see the young boy is full of joy. And this, and then the story of the film is what is a journey that he makes so that life becomes meaningful again. Which means that in the context of what we do as healthcare professionals, that we absolutely have to take on board that we need to work with the network, the supportive network that surrounds people. Because if we have an intervention which makes life more meaningful and more valuable, then we should be doing that. That the therapeutics, answering people's worries and fears and helping them plan for the future is one bit. But making the most out of the time that's left is probably the most important bit. So when we think about networks, then I've kind of conceptualized it because I think it helps to talk about it. And that we can think in the middle that you've got the person with the illness and surrounding, and I'm borrowing here from the work that was done by Rosemary Leonard, Debbie Horsell and Kerry Newman in Australia, who described about the inner and outer network. But you could think about the person with the illness. And then you think about the inner network of people who are closest to that person and have regular contact and maybe even deliver hands-on care. And the outer network are the people who surround the inner network. And I think this is, when we're thinking about volunteers, that people automatically assume that if you're doing a volunteer, it's about direct contact with the patient. But in fact, we know that from our own experience that the tasks of life are hard enough when you're well. Doing all the things of the shopping, the cooking, the cleaning, mowing the grass, whatever it is, getting it all organised is pretty exhausting. And trying to do that in the context of caring for somebody and dealing with the emotional stress of seeing the person you love most of all deteriorate and die, it adds an enormous burden. So that if there is an intervention which the outer network can support the people in the inner network, a number of small jobs actually make an enormous difference. And then surrounding that is the community of neighbourhood, of people who live close by, maybe of digital support. You're all experts in that now. And surrounding that are service delivery organisations of hospices, hospitals, whatever it is, district nursing services. And that we know that if we are going to implement community development, it needs to be supported by policy as well on a whole variety of different levels. And what's quite helpful is to think about where do we see ourselves geographically within those circles of care. And I think sometimes as health professionals see themselves somewhere near the middle. But as Alan has spoken about, actually, health professionals have minimal contact with people in their last year or so of life, and they have a much more peripheral role. And that the role of the inner and outer networks is much more important in terms of enhancing people's lives and making the most. So, I want to do a little thought experiment. This is this in terms of enhancing networks. It's quite a good image of support, and I think sometimes the expression on his face is how people feel when they're facing all of this stuff, and how do we help people through that. So, I want you to imagine that you're going into work, and actually for the people here, this probably won't be like that, but for the majority of people, you go into work and you imagine that you've been given the news that somebody close to you is ill or has died, or some such event like that. And that you go into your office, and the office is perhaps a bit like this, and you feel very alone in that moment. Something that we hear quite commonly is when you talk about this stuff in the workplace, people will say, oh yeah, so-and-so's father died the other day. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. And that's really common, and that's a very isolating experience. You can imagine what that might feel like. You're worried about your job because you're feeling stressed. You're worried about having time off. Are you going to get performance managed? You're feeling depressed. You're worrying about how you're managing at home. And you walk into an environment like that, not because people are unkind, but just because people don't know what to do. So let's now think about Alan's Compassionate Community Charter, Compassionate City Charter, Compassionate Community and City Charter, in that you can think about within a workplace, which is one of the places where you can make an intervention. And there are three things that you can do which have a really significant impact. One is that a policy in the workplace that makes it allowable for people to die and for people to be supporting relatives. That actually you're not going to be scared about the fact that you're having time off to take people to hospital. That the whole performance management thing gets put to the side because people understand what you're going through. That you're allowed to have time off a funeral. That's really helpful because that will automatically takes away some of the worry. The next thing is that in your workplace, there will be perhaps 5% of the people there who people you would naturally turn to at time of emotional crisis. Nothing to do with line management, but just people that have that thing about them that you feel inclined to talk to. Well, if you think that those people might get a small amount of training about how to talk to people who are undergoing these kinds of experiences, and maybe the thing is something simple about just checking in. How are you doing today? Are you feeling all right? Just really simple things about asking about welfare. Is there anything you need? Would you like a cup of coffee or something like that? And then you can imagine the third thing, which is that an email has gone round your office, and that email asks for volunteers, for people who would like to help out in one way or another when people are hard pressed by experiencing death, dying, and loss. And maybe there's simple things like picking the kids up from school, taking somebody out for a drink, maybe just making it a bit easier for them to work, taking a little bit of their workload or something like that. And then what you have is you have a very different environment when you walk into the office for the first time, having heard some bad news. Quality of the photo is not great, but that's the best I could find. But this really, I thought this really expressed it. I'm not sure which one is who, but nevertheless, you can imagine yourself walking into the office knowing that there is active kindness and support in the office, and knowing that actually you are going to get help. And that is so different from the feeling that you get through there. So then you can think about, well, let's see what this looks like if we start to implement the Compassionate Community Charter, because then you start thinking about, you can do this everywhere. Doesn't matter where it is, educational institutions, workplaces, trade unions, hospices. Are hospices themselves compassionate? With the homeless, with the imprisoned, museums and galleries. Wherever there are people, there are naturally occurring supportive networks. So that what we can do is look to see how can we enhance those naturally occurring networks. And you can see that actually the numbers start to get really large of people who would be willing to be involved. So, that's not the next slide. Maybe it is. I don't need to go over this because you already heard Alan talk about it. And so then what happens when we actually start to do this work? And I'm borrowing from, I've taken excerpts from the report that came out of the University of Western Sydney about a project they've been running in Sydney for many, many years. And so what kind of things happens when we do it? And these were the themes that came out of it. And I'm not going to read the quotes out because you can read those for yourself, but it takes a community. 4 themes. Theme 1, it takes a community. Each and every one of you had this little part to play, and you can definitely see that in the context of the inner and outer networks. Theme 2, staying connected. Strength in numbers, resisting isolation. There's a really common thing that happens, which is friends and neighbours who hear about the bad news say, "I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" And the almost automatic response is, "No, we're managing fine." So we've got a little campaign going at the hospice, which is that we explain this and we say, no is not the right answer. You have to say yes. And the yes is not about now. It's about starting the process so that when the illness comes on, that the networks are already established and supported. Theme 3. the ordinary becomes the extraordinary. So everyone doing a little bit makes an enormous difference. And theme 4, which is about the process of transformation. And actually, this is perhaps the most profound one, because people who help out like this, and we recognize this again, and we've heard it again and again during the conference, is that when people actually help out, they really know that they've done something good and that something has changed within them, and that the benefit that they get is as great as the benefit that the people who are getting the support get. And it's why people carry on doing this, because they know, and what we see is, and we've heard again and again, is how deeply committed people are to doing this. This is a very different story from one we get from the media. It's actually about human connection and value and meaning in life. So here's another one. It wasn't asked for, it just came by itself. And we have so in our projects in Western, we have people saying the network support was fantastic, and actually we had to reduce the professional care because there was too many people coming in and out of the house. So I had the other day, on Tuesday, when we had a site visit at the hospice, and Sue Gerry who is running our Compassionate Community Programme, had been running for many years the buddy group. And it was one of the most memorable experiences in medicine I've had. So the buddy group, although you've heard, some people have heard about this already, we started doing a bit of work with people pre-bereavement, and that's with the patient and with the carer, and then those people formed relationships, and they wanted to stick together afterwards because they found that sticking together was incredibly supportive. And so out of that grew the buddy groups, and they met on a regular basis, and they were going through bereavement at a kind of similar time, and they supported each other, and they met every month, every couple of weeks. And that was 7 years ago. And we're on buddy group 6 now. And Sue described how, what the impact of the buddy group was, about how it returned meaning to people's lives. They went on holiday together, they went out together, the group itself could see people, the commonality of experience meant that people could talk to each other, and that people became great friends. And then after, so Sue had been speaking for about an hour, and Val was there talking about, Val is one of the people who's been through as a carer, and actually this initiative has been so effective that Val and Steph said, Sue, we don't need you anymore, we're going to run the group ourselves, and which is perfect, it's terrific, so we really like that. But then after about an hour, the buddy group from 6 years ago came in, and there was this explosion in the room of joy, of greeting and laughter, and it was incredible. It was the active demonstration of what could be done through using this kind of approach, about supportive community networks. And actually, it is much more than we could ever do as a healthcare intervention. That it returned meaning and value to people's lives. And when I asked them about, about what do you think the impact of you stopped you becoming depressed, and what about all the stuff about suicide? They all had suicidal thoughts. What about ill health, sudden death, all of that? And they just agreed that it absolutely transformed the whole experience. And what that means is that community interventions are not just an add-on to what we do in palliative care. They are actually a critical part of it. And the more supportive networks we can set up in using a public health approach, the more impact it has on people's lives. And the impact is enormous, is absolutely, should be, and is a critical part of what we do. And that you can, supportive networks are anything, to be honest. Even cats and donkeys. Actually, animals have an enormous role to play. So, just to finish up, I have a challenge, which I'm sure you're all taking up anyway. But if building community networks has such a big impact, how much of what we can do as healthcare professionals, health or social care professionals, any kind of professionals, how much could be done by non-professionals, by the supportive network, whatever that is, wherever they're placed on the circles of care. And not just that, how much more meaningful would it be of an experience for both the people who are on the receiving end of the care and the people who are participating in the care. Thank you very much.
Julian, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely terrific and tremendous. I think we've got about 3 minutes for some questions, so I'm not going to babble on, but if anyone wants to ask or challenge on anything. There's a hand up at the back. Could you introduce yourself to the room when you... There's a microphone on its way, just behind you.
Rosemary Leonard, one of the authors of the Home report, and I really just wanted to say that if anyone wants copies of that report, just give me a card or write down an email or something, and we can send it to you. Also, there's a new report that is going to print practically as we speak, I think. So we can send that one out as well.
Thanks, Rosemary. Thank you for the great work that you did. Any other observations or comments?
I'm happy there are none. Stunned silence is good, particularly with this audience.
Or a couple over there.
Hi, Julie. I really enjoyed that presentation. I guess one
So
question
could you introduce yourself?
where we are. I mean, there are some parts of Devon and Cornwall where I totally get about networks, but there's some parts of Devon and Cornwall actually in the winter there isn't a community because of second home ownership, holiday homes and things like that. And I think possibly the role of the charities is to galvanise groups of volunteers and help volunteers move forward as compassionate neighbours, and to become those neighbours, to become those networks, because we do have to recognise in some communities, you know, and family breakdowns, family movement, sometimes people cannot have those individual networks, and the challenges of rural communities. Do you think it's different?
I mean, I think it happens everywhere, to be honest. And I think that if you're thinking about implementing the Compassionate Community Charter, where you get large numbers of people involved, there are going to be significant numbers of people who are prepared to do hands-on care. And that why not have hospice at home services or the equivalent run by volunteers? It's looking after people who are terminally ill is something that humans have always done. It's only recently that we've professionalised it. And I think that a part of the reason for doing the circles of care diagram was to help professional organisations see the role that they play, so that actually they can think about, we can look at the supportive network first of all, and then see where the gaps are. And then, okay, so, but then you still wouldn't go to, oh, we've got to have the domiciliary care agencies going in with a care package, because that suffers from all the same things. You maybe have 30 people go through the house in a week. They come in twice a day, 3 times a day for a period of 15 minutes. There are different faces each time. It's very, very difficult to establish relationships. What about having a supportive team that surrounds the patient, and that team is made up of family and friends and volunteers, and that it's supported by health professionals? Actually, that would make palliative care look very, very different. And it would, what it would mean is that you've got that supportive network where everyone is in, their meaning and value in life is enhanced by participating. So I think there's a potential to take a very different look about what we're doing from a palliative care perspective and see if, raises a question, could we structure services so that this wasn't predominantly cancer, that this was about everyone who's dying? Why not, actually? Because if you're getting community support and having health professional support for those communities, actually it makes it much more feasible.
Julian, thank you very much for that. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. There was one other hand up. If that person could grab hold of you afterwards, I think that would be great. Julian, just to say, here is the surprise mystery box that we've seen handed over to every speaker. It's now your turn to get yours.
Thank you. Is this the medal that I can hang around my neck?
It is. Yes, thank you very much. I'm now delighted to invite Richard Smith to come and speak to us. Again, you'll see Richard's notes in the brochure. All I'd say is the thing that sprang out at me was Richard's work at the BMJ, which after Simon Noble's terrific presentation earlier today, I don't know if you saw or heard Simon Noble and how to get published, Richard. It was terrific, and I hope that you'll be able to bring, I'm sure you will, the same verve that he did. No pressure. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So my theme is death, the upside. And so this is my argument. The first thing is that death is a good thing. And, you know, the killer argument for that is that without death, every birth would be a tragedy. And sadly, I think we're almost at that stage. We live in a society, perhaps not all of you do, that denies death. And this denial in itself causes pain and suffering. Death denial also diminishes living and causes problems beyond healthcare. And sadly, I think that doctors are probably more part of the problem than they are part of the solution. I'm some sort of doctor, or if anybody keels over, I'm no use whatsoever. And I want to end by saying we need to rediscover the positive side of death. So to start off with, I would like to play you just a few moments from Shostakovich's 15th String Quartet. My argument is that much of art, music, poetry, drama is inspired by death. Death is a great inspiration. I mean, a lot of philosophers argue that it's the most important thing about us, that we're going to die. And Shostakovich composed this in 1974, just a few months before he died. And actually, almost every single one of his 15 quartets is a meditation on death. This one has 6 movements, all adagio. It's usually played by candlelight. And he said that people should play it so that flies drop dead in midair and the audience start leaving the hall from sheer boredom. But let's hope that doesn't happen. I'm not going to play that much of it. And while it's playing, I'm just going to flash through a few pictures that illustrate, you know, the way that death has inspired art. Take it away, maestro. Okay, thank you. So you can see that the other great inspiration, of course, is sex, and there the two are combined together. I was going to read you a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, which is a fantastic poem about death. Most of her poems were about death. She was pretty well the most popular poet around in the 1920s in the US, but I want to be sure to finish on time, so I won't. So instead, let me tell you, that is my father. He died in 2004. He was the most wonderful man, and he had the most wonderful death. very close to here in Bath, which is where he lived. He died at home. We were around him. He died very peacefully. He didn't even have any opiates or anything. And after that, we had a funeral. He was a very funny man. My brother's a stand-up comedian, and we kind of laughed throughout it because, you know, he died at 81. What was there to be sad about? He was a lovely man, and he lived a lovely life. This is my mother in the Rose Garden in Greenwich Park. She's still alive, but actually she's had no short-term memory. I hesitate to use the word demented, although she lives in a nursing home now for 9 years, and of course that severely limits what she can do in life. And I think my mother, I see her every week. We laugh, we have a good time. She's a very funny woman too, and yet remarkably her language stays intact. But it's not what she would have wanted to be. I think she could go on for another 10 years. So there are essentially, as probably you all know, 4 ways to die. One is bang, sudden death. That's a minority of deaths. One is death from cancer, where you kind of bang along, and then on the whole, you go down over weeks, months, not that long. The third way to die is organ failure, whether it's heart failure, respiratory failure, where you keep having these dips, you know, and you don't quite know which is the one that's going to finish you off, meaning that doctors are inclined to go on too long. And then, of course, there's the one that my mother's dying of, the long, long, slow death of dementia or frailty. So I want to see how you would like to die. Now, who would like here to die? So you've got 4 choices. I'm sure you remember what they are. Who would like to die a sudden death? Right, so that's quite a lot of you. Right, how many of you would like to die of cancer? Right, just a few. That's interesting. Yeah, actually more than in an average audience. How many of you would like to die of organ failure? We've got one taker over there. I don't quite know which form of organ failure it is. And how many of you would like to die the long, slow death of frailty or dementia? There's nobody at all. But that's actually probably what most of us are going to die of, unless we do something different. So anyway, because I'm an enthusiast for death, I write a lot of blogs, and I wrote this blog in the BMJ. It was just before Christmas. Actually, it was mostly about Louis Buñuel, the filmmaker, and he meditated a lot on death. Death features a lot in his. But in the title there, you can see I said, dying of cancer is the best death. Now, I thought I was writing this for a handful of doctors. I don't know who many. I write it primarily, to be honest, for myself. It didn't really occur to me anybody much would read it. But the next morning, after I posted it, my daughter came in and said, "Oh, I see you're in the Daily Mail." And this just went berserk. I mean, this went all over the world. I mean, in a way that I've written a lot of things over the years, but never. And you can see that there were 1,900 comments, and it went into 102 publications around the world. I work a lot in Bangladesh. It was in the papers there. It was in the papers in China, in New Zealand, in Australia. Now I've become big in Brazil. I've always been asked to do things in Brazil because of this. And here were some of the comments. What a strange man. I wonder what planet he's from. I like this one. If he was my doctor, his ass would be fired faster than he could scribble his name. So this was quite an interesting experience for me. I must confess I haven't read all 1,900 comments. As this was going on, I was rung up by this man, Sir Anthony Grabban. You can see he's a fine-looking man. He was a consultant surgeon. He was chairman of the BMA. And I thought, we used to work very closely together when I was at the BMJ, and I hadn't seen him for a while. And I thought he was ringing me up to kind of chastise me over this. But in fact, he was ringing up to do exactly the opposite. He was ringing up to say, I'm dying of cancer, I've got 4 weeks to live, and I want you to write my obituary. So I got on the train the next day, I went up to see him. We had actually a fantastic time. We could catch up on everything. Then I knew, because he's a slightly controlling man, he wanted to see his obituary before he died. So I showed it to him, and we had a whole debate about whether he was ruthless or not. I said, well, I think you are ruthless. He said, no, I was ruthless once, but not routinely. So we left him ruthless, and then in the end he gave in on that one. And then I also had in that he was vain. And he said, well, I don't think I'm vain. I think I said, oh, if you look at him, you can. And so I took that one out, but perhaps I shouldn't have. Although he did say to me as we were having this discussion, he said, I suppose the very fact we're discussing it probably means I am deaf. And I wrote a blog about that, write an obituary of the living. And oddly enough, I was doing one at the weekend, only Dave Sackett died just before I could get it to him. But I got a message from him. It said, off to terminal care, farewell. And he was another man who lived a kind of wonderful life. So I think there is undoubtedly, in my mind, an upside to death. But this is, and of course Tennyson would agree. This is what Tennyson wrote in Memoriam, one of the great poems of the 19th century. Oh, happy men that have the power to die in grassy barrows of the happier dead, release me and restore me to the ground. Thou seest all things, thou wilt see my grave, thou wilt renew thy beauty morn by morn. I, earth in earth, forget these empty courts, and thee returning on thy silver wings. And here's Bernard Shaw saying, use your health even to the point of wearing it out. This is where it is. Spend all you have before you die. Do not outlive yourself. And I don't quite know whether my mother thinks she's outliving herself. I think she might have done, but I haven't had a... Actually, we talk all the time about death, and she looks... I mean, although she's a cheerful woman, she kind of looks forward to it in a way. But I think the crucial argument is that if you think that death's a bad thing, and probably most of you don't, I think the one thing that is undoubtedly worse is immortality. I think all the philosophers that have examined immortality come to the conclusion that it's absolutely appalling. It would be unbearable. So this is a famous, this is the Macropolis case, which is a famous essay by Bernard Williams, a philosopher. And Eleanor Macropolis, that's her there, quite a fine-looking woman, especially considering she was actually 342 when this is from the opera, but she was at that point 342, and she had been given by her father the elixir of eternal life. And luckily, she didn't age. She didn't look 342, she looks just 42. But although vulnerable like any human being, she hasn't suffered from any disease or injury, but her unending life has come to a state of boredom, indifference, and coldness. Everything is joyless. For her, singing and silence are the same. So eventually she refuses to take more of the elixir. She ages horribly to 342 on the spot and dies. And then they have a debate about, well, do we want the elixir? Would we like to keep the elixir and use it on others? So how many in the room would like to have the elixir of immortality? Any takers? Oh yeah, there's one over there. Okay, well if I can get some, I'll sort it out for you. So I think, and here's Schopenhauer. Philosophers think a lot about death, and actually there's a marvelous book called How Philosophers Die, which is full of jokes from beginning to end. And Schopenhauer, who was said to be the most miserable man who ever lived, and in his deathbed he said, there was only one person who could understand me, and that was me. But he said to desire immortality for the individual is really the same as wanting to perpetuate an error forever. So, but I think sadly, despite this upside to death and the downside of immortality, we live in a death-denying society here in Britain. And here's a fantastic survey from Dying Matters, which I'm sure most of you know the organisation. So, as we just heard, 64% of people do not feel comfortable talking to somebody who has a friend or family member who's died. 24% have not known what to say, 28% talk about the death only if the person mentions it first, and 65% agree that people in Britain are uncomfortable discussing dying and death, and that's 78% of those over 65. And they asked people how old they would like to die. 19% would like to die between 91 and 100. 9% would like to die over 100, although good data show that if you die, of all the people who die between 90 and 95, 50% die that way, and 15 stupid people would like to live forever. And here's an extraordinary thing. 14% of people think it's, sorry, I didn't mean to insult them. 14% of people think it's no part of the health professional's job to talk to me about where I would like to be cared for when dying and where I would like to die. Well, 52% want that conversation when diagnosed with a life-limiting illness, not before. Only 14% want the conversation when well and healthy. 40% have not discussed the type of funeral they would like, so when they die, you think, oh God, what are we going to do with them? Should we cremate them? Do they want to be buried? They should have asked them, it's a bit late now. 65% have not discussed where they would like to die. 61% have not discussed the type of care and support they would like at the end of their lives. And one of the things they asked about was words, that people use instead of death and dying. Have you noticed that it's actually becoming almost obscene to say somebody's died? Everybody passes now. And strikes me as absolutely extraordinary. So here are the phrases that people used instead of dying. Passed away, deceased, kicked the bucket, passed on, gone to a better place, popped their clogs, departed, 6 feet under, brown bread. Well, that of course is rhyming slang. You can tell from my voice I have Cockney roots. And the idea here is that these phrases will be more comforting to somebody who's just experienced a death than to say, oh, I'm sorry, so-and-so died. So to say, oh, I'm sorry that your husband is brown bread, I can't quite see how that's going to be comforting. And then the others were pegged, croaked, met their maker, fallen off their perch, turned their toes up, cashed in their chips, sleeping the big sleep. It's rather a kind of romantic one. And I have a quote to sort of illustrate all this craziness. This is Jane Fonda in her 70s. I don't know how many of you, I'm 63 and I seem to be aging much faster than her. And it's a quote that I use all the time, which comes from a friend of mine I was at university with, who says, in Glasgow, where I was born, death felt imminent. In Canada, where I trained, it was thought inevitable. In California, where I live now, it's viewed as optional. And it seems to me that there are lots and lots of people going in the California direction and not too many people going in the Glasgow direction. So we live in a society that denies death, and I think this causes suffering and problems. 52% of people agree that from this survey, if we felt more comfortable talking about dying and death, people would be less likely to die alone. 68% of people say my quality of life is more important to me than how long I live for. 88% of GPs agree that people in Britain felt more comfortable discussing dying, death and bereavement. It would be easier to have our end of life wishes met. Oops, I keep sort of jumping to here, I apologise. And I think that even importantly, and the point was made in the previous speech, that actually denying death is also in some ways to deny life. So this is Montaigne. I don't know how many of you have read To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die. I think it's the finest thing I've ever read on death and dying. I really recommend it to you. It's only about 5 pages long. You can download it from the internet. So he who would teach men to die would teach them how to live. 'Tis the condition of your creation. Death is part of you, and whilst you endeavour to evade it, you evade yourselves. Give place to others as others have given place to you. And here is Thomas Brown, the great kind of 16th century physician. We are happier with death than we would be without it. And this is Iona Heath, who some of you might recognise, was until recently president of the Royal College of General Practitioners. And she said, without death, there is no time, no growth, no change. If we avert our eyes from death, we also erode the delight of living. The less we sense death, the less we live. And I absolutely agree. And then I want to make the point that I think actually this denial of death extends into problems beyond healthcare. And this is a quote from Lewis Lapham, a very kind of witty writer who's the editor of Harper's. Now he edits something called Lapham Quarterly, and he has a whole volume. It's all writings about death. But he says, he's an American, the reluctance to look death in the face I take to be the root cause of most of our 21st century American sorrows, socio-economic and aesthetic as well as cultural and political. I know that dying is un-American, nowhere mentioned in our contractual agreement with Providence, but to regard the mere fact of longevity as the supreme good without asking why or to what end strikes me as foolish, a misappropriation of time, thought, sentiment, electricity, and frequent flyer miles. Of the 2.4 trillion assigned last year to the care and feeding of our healthcare apparatus, a substantial fraction paid the expenses of citizens in the last, often wretched years of their lives. Who benefits from the inventory of suffering gathered in the Florida storage facilities? So denying death causes problems beyond healthcare. But now, sadly, so our doctors, my argument is that doctors are unfortunately more part of the problem than part of the solution. This is a Dying Matters survey, again, not of ordinary people, but of doctors. So a third of GPs said they'd never initiated a conversation with patients about their end-of-life wishes. It seemed to me absolutely extraordinary. I could hardly believe it. And that was 40% of male GPs and 29% of female. 44% haven't written a will, 48% haven't registered to become an NHS organ donor or have an organ donor card. 54% haven't told somebody whether they want to be buried or cremated. I hope you're all absolutely clear on this. A friend of mine, John Lanchester, has written, a rather successful novelist. The first line of one of his books about his remembering his begins with him leaving a funeral just after she's been cremated and suddenly remembering she wanted to be buried. Well, it's a little bit late by then. 65% of GPs haven't talked to someone about their end-of-life wishes, and 93% don't have any form of living will. How many of you have a living will or advance directive? It's interesting. I'd have expected all of you to have one. In the National Confidential Inquiry into Patient Outcome and Death, in one 2-week period, every one of 52 patients who explicitly stated that they wanted to be allowed to die were given cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It's becoming the way we die. 9 out of 10 patients had never been asked about their wishes should they suffer a cardiac arrest, despite being considered at high risk. In 7 cases, people with terminal illness were given CPR after a cardiac arrest, even though their clinicians believed they would not recover from their illness and should be made comfortable in their last days. This is a terrible indictment of healthcare. And this is Siddhartha Mukherjee, who I think has, his book, The Empress of All Maladies, The History of Cancer, is a fantastic book. You'd think, whoa, why would I want to read that? But actually, it's a real whodunit. It's a thriller from page to page. And he says, the resistance to providing palliative care to patients was so deep that doctors would not look us in the eye, this is a nurse speaking, when we recommended that they stop their efforts to save lives and start saving dignity instead. Doctors were allergic to the smell of death. Death meant failure, defeat, their death, the death of medicine, the death of oncology, and that's what the nurse said. And this is the person who I suppose inspired me most to thinking about death. This is Ivan Illich, whose book, The Limits to Medicine, was published in the 70s when I was a medical student, had a huge impact on me. And he says, a society's image of death reveals the level of independence of its people, their personal relatedness, self-reliance, and aliveness. And this is Atul Gawande. I'm sure many of you have read his book, Being Mortal, which made it to the top of the bestseller lists in the US. And he says, In the past few decades, medical science has rendered obsolete centuries of experience, tradition, and language about our mortality and created a new difficulty for mankind: how to die. So, doctors are part of the problem. What can we begin to do about this to create a society where we recognize the significance, importance of death, and in some senses celebrate it rather than deny it? And, we do have, I'm sure some of you in the room must be associated with this, we now do have social movements that are beginning to make this happen. So this is Dying Matters. It's Dying Awareness Week this week or next week?
Next week.
Next week, yeah. And this is the Scottish equivalent, which I know too is represented here. Good life, good death, good grief. And this was an extraordinary event that I went to. This was a death festival on the South Bank, which is the big arts complex in London. It went on for 3 days. I went to every minute of every day of it, and it was just extraordinary. It was a huge demonstration of Ghanaian coffins, for example. I'm sure that you know that if you want to be buried in a sort of replica of an electric guitar or a coconut or a house, you get it made in Ghana. There was music, there was plays, there was poetry, there was debates. You had to queue for about an hour to get into a session on suicide. It was really quite extraordinary. There were architects talking about graveyards around the world. And it was really set up along the argument that we used to kind of do all this stuff in church back in the 19th century when everybody went to church. Now most people don't in Britain. We don't really have a place for talking about these things. But you can imagine it was a tremendous risk to put this on, but it was a big success. And it shows that there is an appetite for thinking about and talking about death. And this is my last slide. This is at the end of the road where I live, in Clapham, in London. It's Holy Trinity Church. I walk my dog past there each day, and he does a little pee just there in the front of the church. And this is the church of the abolitionists. And they're often described, the people who campaigned in Britain for the abolition of slavery. And I think they're often described as the first social movement. They invented many of the things we associate with social movements: gathering of evidence, slogans, logos, songs, campaigns, using the media, lobbying politicians. And this was their church. They were they're often described as the people who were the early Victorians, because they came at the end of the Georgian age, when people kind of lived over dangerously before everybody got straight-laced. And I think that the story of the abolitionists shows how much can be achieved, what might look impossible. So as we're living in a world where it becomes slowly impossible to say someone's died, and we've got to say they've passed, and we seem to have increasing death denial, it is possible to turn things around. So there were 12 men, in those days it was men, who met in 1787 in a place in the city of London and said, we want to abolish slavery. And people thought, well, that's ridiculous. Probably of all the people who'd ever lived, more people had been slaves than had been free. The Greek, the Roman, the Ottoman empires were built on slavery. Many members of parliament in Britain owned plantations. The Church of England owned plantations that were depended on slaves. It was something like 5% of the British economy. Coffee, sugar, rum, things that people love, all came from slavery. So the idea you could reverse it seemed absolutely impossible. And yet, within 20 years, with the French Revolution in the middle, they had succeeded in getting a law that began the end of slavery. So it is possible to turn around death denial, and you are the people to do it. Thank you.
Don't go away, Richard. I just want to present you again.
Right, with the mystery box.
The mystery box. Thank you so much, Matt, and your challenge to us at the end of our final afternoon, or towards the end of our final afternoon, about being a people movement, because actually that is how we will affect the change that you've so dramatically described to us. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you again to Julian as well. Everybody go and enjoy your seminars. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, so tell me when you're past, and just say like you're back. Oh, lovely, thank you. I think that's good. Can I take this one? Where's the oh, it's this one.
So that's why I'm thinking that when I start to do that one wash off, then I'll get one out to say I'm yeah, people find some same with the cards, I think the cards are really good get them in to write their name. If they want to be a part of it, find a project.
So what we need is some paper for that. So use that list.
This one. I just pressed water.
This was your chocolate.
All right, good to see you. Everything safe?
Something else better.
Yeah. So I'm talking about the be easier.
Good afternoon, everybody. If you're in here for the first seminar of the afternoon, would you mind, I hate to be prescriptive about these things, but actually we think it would be a much better experience if you could just come forward so we're all grouped together. So we're going to be talking about some quite intimate aspects and issues, and also we've got some things to hand around, and it would make it an easier, better workshop and seminar to do together. Very good. If you just sit yourself on the table and take us towards the front, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're just in the middle.
Just in the middle, it's fine. Is that right? I'm delighted both people coming forward. Again, we're limited to time, so if you look in the programme, you'll find Claire's abstract and biographical details. I'm delighted to introduce Claire Turnham, who's going to be leading the session, and Claire will be giving me instructions to do various things during the course of this. I might actually sit myself down at the front if that's all right, rather than chair it from there. It'll be easier to do that.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to everybody who's come in to listen to this. I'm going to be talking today on paying it forward, how participation, care and connection with our loved ones at death leads to future community participation. Everything that you see on the slides are personal photos of families that I have been involved with, whether they've been my own or other local families that have whose loved ones have died, and we have worked together. We're all familiar with the idea of paying something back, but how about paying it forward, giving before you receive? I'm here to propose that within the framework of helping, supporting and caring for families at death and after death, that we can work on the basis of trust and love, without the expectation of what we may receive in return. Paying it forward is about caring, sharing, and connection. It's something that we've all been talking about so far throughout the whole conference, and I'm very honoured to be here to talk about it again from the point of view that what happens after death as well as before. Mostly, paying it forward is about unconditional love. It's an action made without attachment or expectation of what comes back. From the way that I approach my work only with love, I see this in countless meaningful and unexpected ways, which makes my service possible and sustainable. Families and communities helping each other and themselves compassionately, simply with kindness and gratitude in the spirit of one human family and community. In my experience, when we're encouraged to embrace death by lovingly participating in this way, we feel more empowered to confidently support, guide, and give back to each other, ourselves, and our community. I'm going to begin now by talking about my own experience caring for my father after he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. When my father Ivan was suddenly diagnosed, it was a complete shock. We were at a routine hospital appointment and we were expecting to be given him the all clear. Instead, we were told that he was going to die, and whilst the oncologist couldn't say when, he felt it would be soon. And from that life-defining moment, everything changed. In essence, whilst I understood that medically no more that could be done, I felt as a family that we could help him. And ultimately, I knew that in my heart we could not change the outcome, but intuitively, by being fully present and by being there for him, we could change the journey. So I summoned all my courage, I faced my deepest fears, and I shared the simple truth to the best of my understanding with each of my 4 children. They were aged 3 to 13 years at the time. It was Dad's wish to remain at home and to live until he died, and that's exactly what he did. We lived with him throughout this time, staying with him in his own home, and the photo that you can see of the 2 of us was taken on a family outing the day before he died. This now is a priceless memory of a beautiful day we shared together. With the support of family, friends, and the local hospice, I devoted my time to lovingly caring for my dad at home. And with each passing day, we became more attentive, more caring, savouring every moment, making it last. We lived totally in the moment until he died, gently cradled in my arms, surrounded by us all. It was a loving, awe-inspiring time, and he died with my blessing, without pain and in peace. My dad's death was something like the most beautiful, natural, and calm death possible. And after sitting in vigil at his bedside during what seemed like a long labour, similar to a birth, he died consciously, without fear, knowing that he was loved. He was able to speak right up until his last breath, and he told me that the care that we had given to him was priceless, that he loved us unconditionally, and that he was proud. I feel very proud being able to share this story with you today, and I trust that he would be too. At the time of Dad's death, I felt it was normal for me to continue caring for him, and so we kept his body at home for 6 days, until we led his funeral. I had home birthed and home educated my children, and to continue to care for my dad, to have a home death and a home funeral seemed very natural. I believe that death care and funerals, just like birth, belong with families. This just made sense. As a child, I'd always felt very safe with him, lovingly holding my hand, and after he died, being able to tenderly touch his hand was very important. When the time came to finally let his body go, I was still able to feel the imprint of his hand, and I still feel it to this day. And in the photos here, you can see Theo, my 7-year-old son, is holding my dad's hand in his coffin. This was something that we all did. We were all there, very physically present, as well as being very mindfully present. With the help of family and friends, we celebrated Dad's life with a beautiful and intimate funeral ceremony in his own much-loved garden. Friends generously gave their time, they bought delicious homemade food to share, and we gathered flowers from his garden and from theirs. My eldest daughter, who was 13, the night that my father was dying, as we sat in vigil, she responded by writing poetry. And at his funeral, we read those poems, and we played his favourite music outside in the garden. You can see in the photo here of all of us surrounding the coffin. This was just before we put the lid on. So each of us, including my daughter who had just celebrated her 4th birthday 2 days before, were all involved in putting the lid of the coffin on, and in fact we all acted as pallbearers for him as well. We gathered in close around his coffin and we spoke words of warmth. We were all surrounded in love. For him, I think it was personal and it was perfect, and I feel very privileged and proud to have honoured his life in such a simple and meaningful way. For myself, this experience has been life-changing and profound. By being actively involved, this has made healing possible, and in the long term, it's been deeply nourishing and sustaining. Dad had told me that the care we'd given him was priceless, and now I'm very honoured and humbled to be able to help other families do the same thing. I'm able to support them to experience the most beautiful end of life that their hearts know is possible for their loved ones too. So I founded Only With Love a year ago, and I feel it's very special actually to see these photos again up today, because a year ago this week was the first time that I'd shown these photos in public, and I have found doing it that I have people have responded very warmly. But I hope that you see what I see, which is photos of tenderness, beauty, love, gentleness, all of the things that death can be when families reclaim caring for their own loved ones. I founded Only With Love, family-led home funerals, as a way of sharing my knowledge, skills and experience to help others. And my future is dedicated to passing on these gifts and to supporting other families to do so, if they wish. For every family that I work with, I devote my time to the best of my ability. And this is not dependent on how much a family can or may pay. Instead, everything I do is offered in the gift. That means I work from my heart, dedicated to gently changing death care one family at a time. I passionately believe that home and family-led funerals offer a value beyond price, and that it's up to each family to determine what that value is and what this holds for them. My service is built on trust, fairness, gentleness, tender loving care for all, but most importantly it's about connection and relationships, and the loving connection made with others. I feel that when families trust me to help care for their dead and their precious loved ones, that in return I trust them to help me continue with this very meaningful work. They can do that in whichever way feels right, comfortable or appropriate for them, and that's depending on their individual needs and circumstances. And for some, that this may be in other ways other than money. I'm only actually standing here today because one of the women that I've helped after the death of her own husband is now actually at home looking after my children today and for the period of this conference, so I can be here. So I'm very grateful to her for that. And she also lends me her fantastic music system whenever I'm involved with a funeral. And these are two ways in which Marina helps me to pay it forward. In the last few weeks, I've been touched very much by the kindness of families who admire the way that I place trust in other people and their families, and it helps me to work. So one of these families, after I supported and guided them with their mother's home death and funeral, offered to not only cover my own time and services, but to pay more generously so that this money can be gifted onwards to another family in need. And this is another example in practice of how paying it forward works, without any expectation in return. As part of OWL, we offer a suspended coffins service, which is a buy one, get one. And it's based on, you may have heard of suspended coffees. It's a play on that, whereby a suspended coffee is a cup of coffee paid for in advance for someone later who needs it as an anonymous act of charity. So within Only With Love, all expenses are provided to families at cost. There is no commission taken. The idea is that families may take up the offer to offer a suspended coffin for another family if they so wish. Earlier in March, I facilitated a workshop for women as part of the Oxford International Women's Festival. Their theme was crossing borders and life and death being the ultimate border. I was very privileged that a woman, a storyteller, came, and her name was Deborah, and she was very nervous about being there. She didn't really know why she'd come. She came very much last minute. She shared with us that she was busy caring for her mother with dementia and also her aunt in Spain, her mother's sister, who also has dementia. As it turned out, Deborah's mother, Betty, died shortly afterwards, relatively unexpectedly. And when I took Deborah's call telling me about her mother's death, I asked her how I may be of help. And she simply replied that we'd already helped her already. What she had learned was that she could care for Betty after Betty had died in the hospice. And this photo was actually taken this year on Mother's Day, and you can see very clearly the connection the mother and daughter had. When Betty actually died, Deborah was with her aunt in Spain and she got the call to come back. And she died actually as Deborah was on the M25 rushing to the hospice. What was amazing was the care that she received at the dementia-led hospice unit. She died with a stranger, a very kind stranger, who said to Betty that Deborah was on her way and not to worry, her daughter was coming. And this was all that Betty needed to hear before she died. So Deborah washed and dressed her, and they had a bedside ceremony. And then her body was actually taken into the local hospital, and they donated her brain for dementia research. And from that point on, I was actually there as an advocate for the family, and we worked together to arrange Betty's funeral in Wales. So a gang of girls gathered her up in a daffodil coffin. We placed daffodils in her arms, and we took her to Wales, all the way down the M4, listening to Tom Jones, holding hands. It was a very meaningful journey, and it was hugely significant because Betty's home was in Wales, and she was returning there for her funeral. Since then, Deborah has offered now to share her story publicly, and she's doing so. And as a storyteller, she's now hoping to help other families to be able to share their stories if they wish to as well. The first person that I met after launching OWL in May last year during Dying Matters Week was Angela. We were hosting a pop-up shop in Camden, and she came in as we were setting up, declaring that we were like angels that had been sent, because until that moment she didn't know that she could continue to care for her husband Peter, who she'd been caring for 15 years. The last 7 years of his life he was bedbound and he couldn't speak. And she explained that she didn't want to hand his body over to anybody after he died, but she didn't know that it was possible or affordable or legal for her to do so until that moment. Peter had frontal lobe dementia, and she had been his wife for 30 years. So we spent much time talking that afternoon about all the options, and I think this is really important. Part of the education and the awareness that we do and offer is so that people know exactly what their options are, and they can make a choice that feels appropriate for them and right for them. Angela let me know that she would contact me when she needed to, whenever that time would be. Meanwhile, at the end of September 2014, I was contacted by a local funeral director who said to me that she was working with a woman whose husband had died 3 weeks before of a sudden heart attack. He wasn't expected to die, he'd only gone into hospital for a routine operation. His wife was deeply in shock, but she felt that she needed to spend some time with him before his natural burial 3 days later. And she knew that she wanted to be able to wash his body and maybe massage him with some essential oils. And so the funeral director rang me and said, I think you may be able to come and help, which is what I did. I went in, and what followed then was the most beautiful and empowering series of events. Now this is Marina that you can see in the photo here. She's the person who's looking after my children. And she's also the woman that was in the first photo of us two with the spade, standing graveside after he was buried. So Marina brought her friend in as well, and they were feeling relatively nervous. And as we stood around the coffin, we weren't sure what to expect, any of us, because Uwe had been, he had died 3 weeks before. But what we did was we began very simply and very gently with a blessing and a welcome and a shared intention. of deep love for the sacred last act. And we initially started washing and anointing his feet using rosemary and lavender from their garden. Marina had often rubbed her husband's feet when he was alive, and this felt for her a very comfortable place to start. She used his own creams as well. And once she began to wash his body, all the fear that she had of his death and his dying melted away. She washed his hands, his whole body, and lastly his face. And throughout this time, she was remembering consciously and with deep thanks what all these parts had done in their lifetime. The feet and the legs for carrying him for so many years, his hands for cooking the most elaborate dinners thinkable, for caring and loving and just touching her in that way that was special to her. She shared with us that he loved to use his ears, listening to music, listening to people, communicating from his heart, using his well-exercised mind. By doing this and being so actively involved, there was a change. There was a change in the room through that whole process. We were there for 4 hours together, and as she became more confident of what was happening, she then felt that she could do more. So the very next day, she went and she hired an MPV car, and she picked up his body from the funeral directors and she brought him home. She's German and he was German, and so all their family on that night were arriving from Germany ready for the natural burial the next morning. And as they all gathered together, she sat up in the car with him, she lit a candle, and she had a very special time, just alone. And the next morning she led the whole funeral procession. She drove him to the burial ground. Even more than that, she then spoke directly from her heart, graveside. So this is her now. You can see how empowered she's looking. She I held the space and directed the funeral on the day, but she completely held the entire ceremony for him. And what was even more special and extraordinary was that as she felt so empowered by having cared for his body, that she then felt strong enough to sing him into the ground. And she stood there with the family bearers and she sang from her belly. And he was lowered into the ground. It was truly amazing, and she honoured him very beautifully and with great courage and love. So we left that graveside together feeling that we'd both done our very best and that it was a transforming moment for her and an experience for both of us. What followed after that was even more extraordinary. 2 weeks later, you may remember I shared about Angela, the first woman I met last year during Dying Matters Week. I'd been working with her at that point because Peter was dying, and so I came in and worked with her just before he died. And she was a Buddhist, and she was very clear that when Peter died, she didn't want him touched by anybody else. She didn't want him touched for 3 days. He died on the Saturday night, and she spoke to the doctors on the Monday morning. They registered the death, and on the Wednesday, together with 2 other home funeral guides who were visiting from America, we spent 7 hours caring for his body. Now, he had been bedbound for so many years, hadn't been able to speak. He had had professional carers as well as Angela caring for him. But being able to care for him now and reclaim him as her husband in her own home was truly significant for her. And during that process, she was able to cut his nails, she was able to wash his hair. It was the most beautiful ceremony, and it was the most sacred and reverent time for all of us. His body was in such a way that I could only describe it that it had used every cell of his being for him to live. And yet he was honoured so beautifully. And I think this work is so special because what I've listened to since I've been at this conference is about how professionals and non-professionals care for people while they're alive and while they're dying. But this work is a continuation of that. It's a seamless service that continues that care for people after they've died. Angela had been his carer for a long time, and she was on a very tight budget. So what was most special next followed is that Marina offered to come and drive Peter's body to the crematorium, to the church and onto the crematorium, and she did this in an action of paying it forward. as part of that, she asked Angela to pay that on in any way that she saw fit, but what she did say to her, if she wanted to donate to a charity, that she suggested Mind, and actually Angela donated to Mind, and the next family that we worked with was actually a volunteer. The man who died was a volunteer for Mind, and so what I'm seeing as part of this working with so many families is that we are all connected. And Marina has said that it feels good to have this connectedness translating into actions and decisions, and to even better to enjoy the warm glow which comes from meaningful interactions and meaningful work. Now, the one challenge that I have for you before I finish today is it's a call of action, and it's partly for paying it forward that I'm working, I have brought into the UK this very simple washcloth in a wet bag. I've got some to pass around. I think Simon's got some. The 3 women who have designed this, 2 of them are hospice nurses, one of them works in a hospital emergency unit, and they offer this to families as a gentle invitation if they wish to care for their own loved ones. What we're asking for is any hospices, anybody at all who would like to work and offer to be a host site to have this project can sign up, and they can have one of these free of charge and just try it for their families. Often for caregivers who are working in a professional way, it's a very good way of linking, connecting each other. It's very simple and it's very beautiful. And, just sorry, before I finish, this is a slide of Marina with the car for Angela. This is Peter's coffin in the car. This is us when we're leaving the church to go onto the crematorium. So the wash bags that are coming round are called one washcloth, and on each of them they have a gift tag which simply says, "This cloth is a gift. Please use it to care for your loved one who has died as a final act of love. You may use it to gently wash the face, hands and body of your loved one as you would have in life. Follow your instincts. There is no right way. There is no rush. And then you may keep this cloth as a gentle reminder of the tender care that you gave at the end." And I think anybody who's cared for their own recognises that sometimes this work is truly difficult, it can be very challenging, but it's never regretted. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a quote that came from the book entitled In the Garden of Delight, written in 1916 by Lily Hardy, which says, "You don't pay love back, you pay it forward." This is my daughter Fern, caring for my dad. She's 10 now, and she describes this time with him as one of the most important times of her life, and she recognises it, she remembers it very, very clearly, and is very proud of the love that we gave him. And I think what I hope to show is that when children are embraced like this, that there is no fear, and there is only love. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was incredibly powerful and moving, and to actually hear you talk about the way you were inspired to start your work with home care and home funerals, coming out of your father's death, having the courage to share that with us, and then to do what you've done is breathtaking. And it actually epitomises all sorts of things that we've gathered here over the last 3 days to talk about. So thank you so much for that. I know you brought some materials along, which are some postcards if people want to take them away, which have got details about how to find out more about what you do. And there's also a sign-up sheet that we've got up at the end of the chairs table up here, that if you want to, you're looking for...
Yeah, looking for host sites.
If you're looking for host sites, so if you... so if people are interested in that, either contact Claire directly or do stick your details down on that. But thank you very, very much. I think we're about to start. We don't have enough time for these, but the next session is due to start imminently, I think. So we'll be here afterwards, but do catch hold of Claire if you want to. But thank you very much indeed, and another round of applause, I think, is well done.
I have got some information I can send it to you, but you see, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful. I'll just put you in touch with Michelle. Yes, please. this is the totem which will encourage us to have that conversation. It's genius. Wow. It's brilliant. Wow.
We're possibly waiting for a speaker at the moment, unless Sarah Murphy's lurking at the back. Are we here acknowledging you being Sarah Murphy? No.
Hi. I think I'm supposed to be here, and it says my name is Sarah, my colleague is sick, so I'm covering for her, and I'm sorry I had to cover in the room.
That's all right, welcome.
So I'm really sorry about that. Let me. This is a bit daunting. This is a big stage. Hi, I'm Angela.
And this Sonia.
Hi, Sonia.
Get you in, or?
Yes, I will, because we've got a plenary in, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
Very
So
tight on timing too.
I'll just whiz through things.
We haven't got Sarah, we've got Angela, who's going to introduce herself, I think. And,
Sure.
And the focus of this session is on end-of-life care and policy.
Yes. Well, hi everybody. Can I apologise first of all on behalf of my wonderful and bright colleague Sarah Murphy, who is not able to be here this afternoon because she's ill. So I undertook to be a poor second to her. My name is Angela Edgell, and I'm the advocacy coordinator at the Irish Hospice Foundation. The Irish Hospice Foundation is a national charity in Ireland which deals with all issues relating to dying, death and bereavement, and our mission is that nobody should face death or bereavement without the care and support they need. So that's just a little potted history of who we are. Now, let me tell you about the Forum on End of Life. As you can appreciate, a lot of the work we do is development and advocacy work. So we do an awful lot of work working within services. So we've got a hospice-friendly hospitals program, we have bereavement programs, we have staff training and development. So we do a lot of development work within the services. So a lot of our services would be kind of inward-facing, looking at what's going on service development. And the Irish Hospice Foundation decided that really we need to look a bit wider. You know, this business of let's involve the service user in what we do, and let's look out about what difference we can make in society. So the Forum on End of Life was set up. It's an initiative of the Irish Hospice Foundation, but it's independently chaired. So it was launched in 2009. And you'll see from the picture, those of you who watch Irish politics, that is the former President of Ireland, President Mary McAleese, who launched the Forum in 2009 as an enormous event. We couldn't believe it. We did a kind of call for people, and hundreds of people turned up, which was really interesting. So between 2009 and 2010, we conducted a public consultation, went around the country, and asked people what would be good, what would be helpful around end-of-life issues. And a national council was set up, and it is chaired by a wonderful woman, Mrs. Justice Catherine McGuinness, who was a former Justice of the Supreme Court in Ireland, and she won't mind me saying this, she's 80 years old and as sharp as a tack and knows everything about everything, and a wonderful advocate. So the membership was experts working in the area of end of life. So we've got ethicists, we've got specialist palliative care doctors, we've got lawyers, architects, interestingly, because they design the places, emergency medics, nurses, everybody. So a good cross-section of people on the board. So as I've already said, the forum met and it had all of these meetings. We had 23 workshops, 108 presentations in the course of the year, and it was all talking about the challenges of dying, death and bereavement, what happens. 167 submissions from members of the public, and again, from individuals to organisations, so there is interest out there. And that picture of the report that resulted from it does it no justice at all, because it was an enormous report, and we still haven't mined all the information in it. So what came out of it? Well, lots and lots of things came out of it, but 4 main issues came out of it. One was about end-of-life care, end-of-life decision-making, and this has been a consistent theme, I think, throughout the conference in the last number of days. How and where do people make their wishes known? So involving the patient, the family, the doctors. In Ireland sometimes, and I'm sure here as well, doctors will ask next of kin to make decisions about whether there's a do not resuscitate. And they have no legal right to do so. So people were a bit worried about this. They were saying, well, how will we know that doctors will fulfill our wishes? And doctors were saying, well, we're in a bit of a legal limbo. So the public demand was to make decisions about end of life and to have a way of recording them. And out of that came an initiative called Think Ahead, which I'll talk about a little bit better later on. The other thing people said was, we have advanced healthcare directives, but they are only recognised in common law. There is no legislation which helps us, no legislation which underpins them. So people said they thought that this would be a good idea too. Interestingly, funerals. The funeral industry in Ireland is one of the least regulated industries in the country. When you talk about regulation, people say, oh, stifles competition. Yeah, right, okay. So funerals were expensive, people were worried about that. But they were also, the funeral industry themselves are saying, nobody has set any standards for us. Anybody can set up, anybody can be a mortician, anybody can do. So they're worried about that too. And they are self-regulated. They set their own standards and keep to those standards. So they have high standards. But there is a lack of transparency to the consumer, and people don't know often whether the funeral director is a charlatan or not. Okay? Now, this is where, this is an interesting one, and those of you who are medics will understand this more than I do, but the pronouncement of death, you have to wait for a doctor to pronounce death. And if you're in a nursing home and somebody dies at 2 o'clock in the morning, it could be 10 o'clock the next morning before the GP comes and pronounces death, and you have someone who is very dead. So there's a campaign looking at having senior paramedics and senior nurses to pronounce death. And as you can see, you know, doctors being pulled away from other duties to pronounce death when other people would do it. The other part, and the most interesting part of this, was the fact that people recognise what has been said here several times, that death is a social matter. It's not just about the health services. You can't just neatly package it up and hand it over to palliative care or hand it over to the health service, because it has other implications. And they include legal, administrative, environmental, social and economic. And we saw today art, education. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. Excuse me. So we very much need a cross-departmental strategy. And a need to end-of-life proof all future strategies and policies. So a life cycle approach, public health approach, life cycle approach. So the forum set up a work plan to tackle these issues, and this is what they came up with. And I'm sorry, I've just given a presentation on Think Ahead, and I've just given out all the forms, so I should have kept one even to show you. So what came out of this, but you can look on the website, and you can write to us or email us and we'll send you something. Think Ahead, a citizen-led tool for people to record their preferences in the event that they are unable to speak for themselves. It's not, there aren't issues of capacity that arise from this, it's just somewhere where people can report their wishes, but it does contain a section which will be a legal advanced healthcare directive when the legislation comes in on advanced healthcare directives in Ireland. And we have been working very closely with the Department of Health and the Department of Justice to have a part inserted into the new Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act 2013, which is still knocking around in committee stage, and will come to the committee on the 27th of May, to replace the beautifully named Lunacy Act of 1871. That's what our capacity law is at the moment, the Lunacy Act 1871. So thank God this will be a big, big piece of legislation. From the Irish Hospitals Foundation's point of view, and the Forum on End of Life, our interest is in the Advanced Healthcare Directive. But obviously the capacity issue is enormous for all of us, and it will be massively important when it's done. So we've been doing a lot of work on that. Funerals. So the National Council produced a discussion paper and a press release on the Irish situation in regard to funerals, and it looked at international models, and it advocated for the inclusion of standards in parliamentary questions and so on. The funeral industry themselves have said that the funeral directors group have said that they don't necessarily need regulations, but they need standards to be introduced and kept and implemented, and they're still working on that. In terms of, now it's such a shame that Sarah's not here, because she's actually on the group that works on the National Council, on the whole working group on pronouncements of death. And there is big discussion going along at the moment in the Health Service Executive, which will be the same as the NHS in a way here, so that's kind of, these are the people who deliver the services in Ireland. We have the Department of Health setting policy, and then we have the people who deliver the services. So they're looking at extending the right to pronounce to nurses and paramedics. And the Forum on End of Life has been invited to sit on this. Okay, look at my way. Now, part of my work is advocacy. Well, all of my work is advocacy, and a lot of the work I do is working with politicians and trying to get them to understand what's going on and why end of life is important. And a lot of that is connecting with people on a personal level. I don't just mean, hello, how are you, do you remember my name? But I mean sharing those experiences that we all do as a human being, one human being to another, and how we sit down and talk about our loss and bereavement, because our only experience of death, other than saying it, is actually losing someone. So we do a lot of work on getting people to know a bit more about how important end of life care is. And from some of our work, a whole series of hearings. The Oireachtas is the Irish Parliament, okay, the Oireachtas Committee on Health and Children hearings. They held a whole series of hearings in November 2013 on end of life. And it was great, because we had one session on, they did 5 different, 5 or 6, anyway, a whole lot of wonderful sessions where they brought in everybody to talk about. They had a whole session on specialist palliative care, a whole session on children, a whole session on bereavement, a whole session on why is end of life important, how is it wider than health, and the recognition was, and the forum presented, members of the forum, my wonderful colleague Patricia Rickard-Clark, who is a former Reform Commissioner, presented for forum, and my CEO, Sharon Foley, presented for the Irish Hospitals Foundation, and it was blowish, it was magic stuff, and it was all reflected beautifully in the report. And the committee very much got the impression that end of life is not just something you hand over to the health service and forget, and it's not just something that they tend to do in Ireland. When you talk about dying and death, they say, oh yeah, that's palliative care, and we've got a palliative care programme, so clear off. It was a much wider recognition. So the committee recognised the importance of the work areas addressed by the forum, and the forum addressed the committee, and that's wonderful. So where to now? In 2015, we're holding our biennial conference. You're very welcome to come over. Ireland is a great place to visit. Dublin is a great place to visit, and I promise you, you'll have a hangover when you go home. But the 2015 conference, the theme is Dying to Talk. So we're all when you look at the stands and you look at the various organisations, we're all dancing around these few words of how do you get dying and death into conversation. So Dying to Talk, conversations about end of life in Ireland. I think some of you will know Catherine Sleeman. She's a palliative medicine consultant. She's going to come and talk from I think from St. Christopher's Hospices. And we have various people talking about dying and death, including an amazing woman who came to a public meeting that we had on Think Ahead, which was hosted by a politician. We get politicians to recognise that talking about this is important. And 4 or 5 of them, including the Prime Minister, have held meetings in their own constituency about Think Ahead, and we've gone along and presented, and people have really liked it. And Think Ahead At one of the meetings, a wonderful woman called Wendy came and said, oh, I really like Think Ahead. I can't stay for the talk. I just came to see, was there anything new that I should know? And we said, well, not really. And my colleague continued to talk to her. We discovered that Wendy is terminally ill. And she has used Think Ahead throughout the course of her illness to work with her family on what she wants. And we were completely blown away by that. She has just done a piece to camera for our website. And she is going to speak at Forum on the 10th of September. As she said, if she is still alive, she will speak at Forum. And if she is not still alive, her daughter will speak in her place. So the importance of getting this out there is really important. The other thing, and I'm sorry, because I'll just go back one. Yeah. I'm just going to go back to this slide where we talked about the Oireachtas Committee. One important announcement that's about to be made in Ireland is that we spoke to the Prime Minister, who very much likes Think Ahead, thinks it's a really good idea, gets it on an emotional level, gets it. Now we're trying to translate that support into making it a bit wider. But he's just, because we've talked to him a lot, he's just instituted a mapping exercise across all government departments to see, first of all, how do government departments look after their own staff. So we're into compassionate workplaces here. Do they have a bereavement policy? How do they look after their own staff? What was their last experience? So just a mapping exercise to see how they look after themselves as employers, how do they look after their employees, but also to look at their services that they give to the public that would impact on people in relation to dying, death and bereavement. So that's a really big deal for us. It excludes the Department of Health because the Department of Health is already doing a review of its end of life. But that's a really big deal. Now, it's only a mapping exercise, but it means we will have the evidence base to say, these are the gaps you need to fill in. This is the way you need to do it. So the good thing is, it's kind of slowly, we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And if we, with the support of all that we've heard, and if we take all these messages back to the organisations that we go to, then there really is a capacity to make enormous change. And I don't want to be overclaiming. What I'm saying is the seeds are there and we've started. So it's good. So the Forum on End of Life has been hugely influential because it's got well-respected people on it, people who are considered sensible experts in the area, and it's not just the usual suspects jumping up and down and shouting about what they want. Because sometimes people think, oh yeah, charities, they're only doing it because it will help increase their profile and get money. Of course that's part of what we have to do, because if people don't see what we do, they won't fund us. And we're 100% charitably funded. Well, we get no government funding at all. We do get co-funding and philanthropic grants on occasions, but that's it. So just to say, the Forum on End of Life has been a really useful exercise. It's a bit like you've got the Dying Matters Coalition in the UK and all that, so it's all about that. It's about bringing in, identifying their advocates and bringing them in and getting them to deliver the message for you to the people who will listen to them, if not you. So I'm afraid I've probably not done my colleague justice, but that's Sarah's contact details, but equally mine are in the programme too, and we will happily answer questions if anybody has them, or send you more information if you'd like us to. That was comprehensive.
Angela, that was incredibly competent. Thank you so much for stepping in as Sarah, which is it's not an easy thing to do when a colleague is ill.
Well, she's so much better looking and much more intelligent than I am.
No, you've done a tremendous job, and thank you so much for actually reminding us of two things, I think, that I've been reflecting on listening to you. One is really the importance of making sure that we've got a policy framework with which we can apply some of the things that we're talking about to demonstrate its relevance, because too often you're faced with a barrier, well, it's very nice, but actually has to fit in. We've got to the day job to get on with. And secondly, the fundamental importance of making sure that all that we're doing is built around what the people with lived experience are telling us about what they need.
Absolutely, and it is about. It was so easy to talk about this because everything that's been said in here, particularly today, resonates with this idea that it comes back to the citizen. It comes back to listening to the person in the bed or on the chair or in the car or on the bus. I mean, it is all about that. It is,
and that's how it's actually people's stories that actually help change decisions as well. Is there any different questions or comments you want to make? Reflections, Angela?
Well, thank you very much. I think my closing reflection is just it's a reflection on the language and we've got a Mental Capacity Act in this country, but we didn't have a statute to replace, actually.
Yes.
But to go from the Lunacy Act of 1871.
Courtesy of the British government, of course, because it was governed by Britain at that stage. It's a lovely, isn't it? Lovely Lunacy Act.
Actually, I could do a very politically correct riff actually about lunacy, but I thought I should park that for the time being. My better judgment is just about kicking in relation to that. But actually, it's very much from, if you like, that bit of legislation that would be based around locking people up.
Yes.
And confining and disempowering in a very fundamental way to something that is based around, which reflects our mental capacity legislation to empowering, supporting, to recognising personhood. And that's such an important thing that we need to keep at the heart of what we're doing.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the thing is, we need to keep reminding, if we want to develop policy, if we want a connection with politicians, we have to keep reminding them that they're part of this too. We talk about citizenship and public servants, and they tend to think, oh, it's somewhere out there, and, oh yes, we'll talk about this in policy terms, and we have a report. But you need to get them to connect. As a friend of mine said, oh yes, your job is to run around shouting at politicians, you're all going to die. But it is, in a way, it's reminding people that you've got to do that you get that connection with them. And I think we heard this yesterday, particularly from Faith, talking about, that you need to get that connection with people and not hit them in the face with it, but remind them. And then say, here we are on common ground. Where can we go from here? Where can we go? The two of us go. And it's a long, slow burn. As I say, don't want to overclaim anything. But it is, I think, a lot about, yes, the robust evidence, yes, the research and the data, but the connection of one human being to another and the power of that is hugely important. And that's what Forum kind of set out to do. And there's a really interesting little infographic which is up on our website here. I'll just give you this is the background on which we work. This was done last year, an omnibus survey, a repeat of one that we did a decade ago. This is 2014. So 80 people die in Ireland every day. That's 800 people newly bereaved if you take the circle of 10 around. 74% say they want to be cared for at home. 53% have experienced loss of significance in the last 2 years. 38% of those deaths happened in hospitals, 26 at home, 12 in nursing homes, 11 in hospices. 39% of the population have never thought or talked about drawing up a will, and 2/3 of the population have never discussed preferences for their end-of-life care. 53% fear their desired place of care will not be available to them when they need it. That's up from 45% in 2004. People are getting less confident about where they want, what's going to be available. 57%, this is an interesting one, say there is not enough discussion about dying and death, and that's up from 51% in 2004. 4 out of 10 people say there is room for improvement in end-of-life care. 82% of people want to be surrounded by loved ones at end of life, and 70% of us want to be free from pain. So interesting little statistics. Not dissimilar from the ones Richard was talking about earlier about deaths in Ireland and so on, but I think maybe a little more open to discussing that, at least in theory. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you very much indeed. And I think we'll be all reconvening back in this room in about 6 minutes' time.
It's on my website. There's one there if you want. Of course, please do. No problem. It's just happy because it's a bit of what we do. Yeah, we did it. Half an hour before, so there was a voting committee hearing government and stuff.
Yes.
You take questions. And there is a picture for them.
It's
It's on our
Yeah, thank you.
So it's our job.
Yeah.
Sometimes they so if you have emails,
Thank you.
we know already. I would agree. One, the basic of I'm sure of calculation version, yeah. I'm so So yeah, no problem. I think it's very much. You're welcome.
You can sort of hear the sort of stuff which goes stepping up.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
How you doing? Outside, but I'm okay. How are you? Oh, right, that sort of thing. Yeah, no, I'm going to try to catch it. I understand it's like 5:30 if I possibly can, but we'll be done by 4:30.
Okay.
Oh, good. But it's great to catch up with you. Yeah, I'll see you in Cody's anticipated, which is hopefully going to go far. Nothing. It's you, the man. You just extraordinary. I mean, I think when you look back at it, I bet you couldn't believe it. And then once you started getting the swing it, I bet you thought maybe it would have been this kind of stuff, you know, I mean, most people, like me, would have a university administration behind them, and a lot of skills. A lot of and some good advice, and you managed to get staff. So, you know, you've got lots of taking into life. It's been, you've been a key point of oh, the hackathon every fucking day. I think it went down very well. To highlight that. It's all familiar anyway, for a lot of people. Although a lot of people did enjoy that last part. Well, I don't my views on this are well known. You know, I expanded some of this last night and I had a drink. This guy is my worst nightmare. You know, I mean, the thing about it is entertaining. You know, I thought Jerry Lewis was fantastic, but I just thought and I think that's that person who got kind as I keep pointing out, not so yeah, that's what did you speak to the and how to do that. But, you know, it needs and it's not raining, it's and the public health should have this is somehow something different. It's a little bit crazy. Yeah, what was it again? If you don't need to enough, I'm sure it's if we do finish yeah, I'll start it. Yeah, just so stay. Do you want to say something? I don't. Why not? Because I already have a role.
Okay. I'm delighted to see that the noisy rattle has continued to grow. It's fantastic. So, we made it. We made it to the last session. Wow, that's fantastic. So everyone will get away early. It'll all be fine. So there's going to be a bit of feedback, and then it'll all be over. It's not dead. It's a rebirth. Okay, so we can start with Kerry, Manju, and Anita.